In the small town of Millhaven, Vermont, where the mornings arrive wrapped in cold mist and the maple trees stand like patient elders along every street, there lived a baker named Arthur. His bakery, tucked between a hardware store and a shuttered post office, was the warmest building in town before the rest of the world even thought about waking up. Arthur was a broad-shouldered man with flour-dusted forearms and a quiet kind of smile, the sort that didn't announce itself but was always there if you looked. He had run the bakery for 22 years, ever since he inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from his. The recipes were old. The oven was older. And the love poured into every loaf was older still. Every morning at 4:30, Arthur rose before the stars had fully decided to leave. He lit the oven, measured his flour by feel rather than weight, and began the slow, sacred work of baking. The scent of fresh bread would drift out beneath the bakery door and curl through the frozen Vermont air like a gentle invitation. By 6 in the morning, long before his shop sign flipped to open, Arthur would step outside into the gray-blue light with a cloth-covered basket in his arms. He walked the same 3 streets every single day, not to deliver orders, but to give. Quietly, without announcement, he left warm loaves on the doorsteps of families he knew were struggling. There was the Delacroix family on Birch Lane, where the father had lost his job at the mill and the mother worked double shifts at the diner. There was old widower Thomas on Cedar Street, who sometimes forgot to eat for days. And there were the Morrison children, 3 of them, whose mother had been ill since autumn and whose cupboards Arthur had once seen nearly bare. Nobody in town talked much about what Arthur did. He didn't want them to. The families he helped rarely said thank you directly, not because they weren't grateful, but because Arthur had a way of disappearing before they ever opened their doors. He seemed to prefer it that way, as though the giving itself was the whole point, and attention would somehow spoil it. Now, Arthur had one employee, a young woman named Rose, who had started working for him 2 years earlier when she arrived in Millhaven with very little money and even less certainty about her future. Rose was sharp and warm and observant, the kind of person who notices everything but says only what matters. It was Rose who first began to understand the true weight of what Arthur was carrying. Rose had noticed, months ago, that Arthur always baked a few extra loaves each morning, more than the shop could ever sell before closing. She had also noticed the way the basket disappeared and came back empty. She never asked. But she watched. And slowly, piece by piece, she began to understand the quiet arithmetic of Arthur's mornings. Then came January. A January so cold that the pipes in half the buildings on Main Street froze solid and the price of heating oil climbed so fast that even people who had been getting by suddenly couldn't. The line at the community food pantry stretched around the corner every Tuesday. Arthur saw it on his morning walks, and quietly, without a word to anyone, he began baking more. He began rising at 3 instead of 4:30. He began buying more flour, more yeast, more of everything. He expanded his route, adding 2 new streets, 6 new doorsteps, 12 new families. His receipts at the end of each week told a story his face never showed. The numbers were shrinking, slowly but unmistakably, like snow melting at the edges of a sidewalk. Rose saw the receipts one afternoon when she was tallying the week's sales. She also saw the supply invoices. She did the math twice, then a third time, hoping she had made an error. She hadn't. Arthur was spending far more than he was earning. At the rate things were going, the bakery would not survive past March. That evening, she stayed after closing and waited for Arthur to come back from mopping the back room. She sat at one of the 2 small wooden tables near the window, the receipts laid out in front of her like evidence at a quiet trial. When Arthur appeared in the doorway, he looked at the papers, then at Rose, and he sat down slowly without saying a word. "You've known for a while, haven't you?" Rose said. It wasn't quite a question. Arthur nodded. He folded his hands on the table, those big flour pail hands that had been feeding this town longer than Rose had been alive, and he said, "I know what the numbers say. But I also know what I saw on those doorsteps." He paused. I can't unknow that, Rose. Rose was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, I'm not asking you to stop. I'm asking you to let me help. Arthur looked up at her. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron pocket and slid it across the table. On it was a list: names, phone numbers, small local businesses, the church on Elm Street, the school board, the credit union. You've been doing this alone, she said, but you don't have to. What happened over the next 2 weeks surprised even Rose. She made the calls herself, on her lunch breaks, in her careful and earnest voice. She explained what Arthur had been doing quietly for years. She didn't exaggerate. She didn't perform. She simply told the truth, and the truth turned out to be more than enough. By the end of the second week, 3 businesses had pledged monthly contributions. The church organized a weekly flower drive. 2 farmers offered grain at cost. Arthur stood in his bakery one morning in early February and looked at the shelves, fuller than they had been in months. He stood there for a long time without moving, one hand resting on the warm surface of the oven, the other pressed flat against his chest as though trying to hold something steady inside it. Rose came in and handed him his apron without ceremony, and the 2 of them got to work. The morning routes continued. The basket still went out before sunrise, still came back empty. But now it was a little larger, and sometimes Rose carried it alongside Arthur, learning the streets, learning the names, learning which doorsteps held families who had never once asked for help and perhaps never would. Arthur watched her and thought about his father, and his father's father, and understood that some things don't get inherited in wills, they get passed on in the gray light before dawn. Spring came slowly to Millhaven, the way it always does in Vermont, cautiously, a little at a time, as though it isn't quite sure it's welcome yet. The maple trees along Main Street began to bud, and the bakery's door stayed propped open in the afternoons to let the warming air move through. Arthur never spoke about what had almost happened that January. He didn't need to. The loaves still went out every morning, and in Millhaven, that said everything that needed to be said.